we have kind of two general formulas that we look at. One being y equals a times sine of b times t plus c. And we have y equals a times cosine of b times t plus c. In both of these cases, t is our variable. In both of these cases, we have that the absolute value of a is amplitude. We have that the period, I should write it consistently. 2 pi over b is the period of our function. And we have that y equals c is the midline. So now, I remember last class I said, like we went through a ton of graphs and we determined the period, amplitude, and midline. And I said, there's some patterns that we're going to see when we look at the graphs in the equations that they're equal to. We're going to see some kind of patterns happening with what the period, amplitude, and midline are. So now we're looking at those patterns. Now we have definitively that if an equation looks like this or this, then we know the amplitude, period, and midline with this small minor calculation to find the period. Okay, so for this first set of problems, we're going to look at all of these and determine the amplitude, period, and midline. So for part A, our amplitude is here. There's secretly a 1 there as always. So our amplitude is equal to 1. Next, when we try to find our period, the period is 2 pi over b, which in this case, 2 pi over b is 4. This is b. So we have pi over 2 is the period. And lastly, when we determine our midline, it's y equals c, and in this case, y is equal to 0. Any questions there? Okay. Then moving on. Next we have our amplitude. Our amplitude is equal to the absolute value of -1. Remember, the amplitude is the absolute value of the a value. Here, our a value is -1, so our amplitude again is 1. The period is equal to 2 pi over b, and in this case, our b value is just pi. This is b. So we have 2 pi over pi. The pi's divide out to 1, so our period is just 2. Any questions there? Okay. Lastly, our midline for this one is y equals c, and again, c is equal to 0 in this case. Any questions there? Okay, we'll keep moving on then. What is my amplitude for problem C?
16.
16, good. And you just take the absolute value of 16, which is 16. What is, well, when we find our period, we do 2 pi over b. What is my b value?
1/2.
Good, we have 2 pi over 1/2. And in case you forgot, when we have a fraction in the denominator, we do keep change flip, so we have 2 pi times 2 over 1, which is equal to 4 pi. Lastly, what is my midline in this case?
Y equals 3.
Good, y equals 3. Any questions there? Okay, moving on. We have the amplitude for part D. What is my amplitude of part D?
7.
7, good. And then when we find our period is equal to 2 pi divided by what? Someone new, please.
Pi over 4.
Pi over 4. And again, we could write this as 2 pi times 4 over pi, which means that the pi's divide out to 1, and 2 times 4 is equal to 8. Lastly, our midline is y equals what? Someone new, someone else new.
-8.
Yes, -8. Good. Any questions there? Okay, problem E. We find the amplitude, which is equal to what?
One 1.5.
1.5, good. We have the period. Which is equal to 2 pi divided by what?
B, which would be 0.6.
Good. 0.6. And this is equal to 2 pi divided by 6 over 10, right? I could write 0.6 as 6 over 10, which is equal to 2 pi times 10 divided by 6, which is equal to 20 pi divided by 6, which is equal to 10 pi divided by 3, if I simplify that. Any questions there? There's a lot of fractions happening, so if you're confused on, even if it's the fractions and it's not necessarily the new information on today, let me know. Lastly, we have the midline, if there's no questions. For E, and the midline for E is what? Y equals?
-0.1.
Careful, we have a negative here, so it's going to be negative 0.1. All right, problem F.
Excuse me, I just have a question.
Yep.
Back to the period for 20 pi over 6. How'd you get 10 over 3 pi?
I divided the numerator and denominator by 3. Sorry, it should be 10 pi over 2. I was dividing by 3, so I should have 2 here.
Okay.
Make more sense?
Yeah.
Thank you for asking that. Okay. Problem F. What is my amplitude?
One over 3.
Good, 1 over 3. And my period is 2 pi divided by what?
Two over
2
pi.
over pi.
Good, thank you guys. 2 over pi. Again, we could rewrite this as 2 pi times pi over 2. The 2's divide out to 1, and we're left with pi squared as our period. And lastly, the midline is y equals what?
2/5.
2/5, good. Any questions on this page?
I just have a question.
Mhm.
On B, you said midline y equals c and y equals 0. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that was just when I was just kind of reiterating that y is equal to the c value. The real answer to that is just y equals 0. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay.
For the period for f, is that
Mhm.
pi to the exponent 2?
Yes, pi to the power 2. Yep. Because we're multiplying pi times pi. And pi is just a number, right? So if I had 3 times 3, we'd probably say that's 9 because we could do that. But we could also write it as 3 squared. And it's easier to write pi squared than whatever 3.14 times 3.14 is out. Okay. Good questions. Any more? All right, we'll move on then. All right, so now we have to look at these graphs and then go ahead and create create a formula of either y equals a sine times bt, or of bt plus c, or y equals cosine bt plus, this should be a capital C.
If we're on loose leaf, do you want us to draw the graphs or
Nope.
just the information?
You don't have to draw them at all. You
Okay.
can just write out the information. All right, so we talked about, A is the amplitude. In last class, we said, you could determine the amplitude by going from the midline to the peak. B is, well, the period is equal to 2 pi over B. If I go ahead and solve this for B, then we have that B is equal to 2 pi over the period. Right, so we could find B now. We'll look at the period like we did last class, and then do 2 pi divided by that period, and we'll get an answer. Perfect. C is the midline. We were able to determine the midline. Usually you could determine it just by looking at it. Sometimes you can't, and you have to do the maximum plus the minimum and divide it by 2 to figure out where that midline is. Again, something that we've been doing and we can do. The last, I think it's the last new piece of information pretty much for this chapter. Yeah, the last new piece of information that we have to learn is when to determine when to use sine or cosine. All right. We notice that out of these graphs, some of them start at the origin or the midline, and some start at the maximum or the minimum. So there's a couple different cases we could have. So what I'm going to do, actually, I think I can insert it here. Add page. Okay. So what I'm going to do, is kind of draw just a little flow chart for you guys. And it would be helpful if you wrote this out yourself, but it's just when to use sine or cosine. And the first thing you ask yourself is, what is the value, the y value, the y value at t equals 0? So that's the first thing I want you to ask yourself. Then there's two options. It's either the max or a minimum, right? So it's either a peak, or it's at the midline, at the midline. Okay. Are we good so far? Right, those are two options. So you either have that you're at a midline. So if this is your midline, or if this is your midline, maybe you start at that point, or you're at a maximum or a minimum. Okay. Are we good up until here? Okay. Next, if we'll start on this left-hand side. Next, we have to ask ourselves, if it's at the midline, we ask ourselves, where does the graph go next? Okay, so where does the graph end up going next? And here it can either go up or down. So it's either going to go up or it's going to go down. Okay. And then when it this side, if it's at the maximum or a minimum, it will either be at the maximum or the minimum. It's a little redundant, but it gets the point across. So we're either looking at something like this or like this. Okay. Any questions so far? I'll just point out that this is the midline. Okay. So now once you get to this point, you could tell whether you're using sine, cosine, and if it's going to be positive or negative. If you follow this flow chart and the y value starts at the midline and then it goes up, you're going to use positive sine. If the y value at t equals 0, you're at the midline, and then you go down, you're going to use negative sine. Any questions there? Lastly, if the y value is at a max or a minimum when t is equal to 0, if it's at the maximum, you're going to use positive cosine. And if it's at the minimum, you're going to use negative cosine. And that's how you determine whether to use sine, cosine, and if you have to flip your graph. Any questions on that? I'll give you guys a second just to write this down. If someone could just give me a thumbs up or just let me know somehow that you guys are done, that you're done writing it down, that'd be great. All right, cool. So now we're going to have to use this. We're going to put this into action. All right. looking at each of these graphs, we're going to have to figure out what A, B, and C are. Okay. I think it's most important. Well, maybe not most important, but usually finding the amplitude is best to do last because you have to figure out where the midline is first. So, but if we could, look at the graph and see the midline, then it's fine to do it in any order. But my first question to you for A, are we going to use sine or cosine?
Cosine? I mean sine, yeah, sorry.
Sine, yep, we're gonna use sine. And will it be positive or negative?
Negative.
Negative, good. Okay, so we know we're gonna use negative sine. And which means that we started at the midline. Okay, so what is my midline?
Y equals 0.
Y equals 0, good. What is my amplitude?
Is it 3?
Yeah, yep, it's 3. Looks like 3. And then lastly, we have to determine, well, let me know what is my period. Remember, the period is the amount of time it takes to complete a cycle. So here's the amplitude. This is the midline.
What is the equation for the period? I can't see it. It's something over b.
It's 2 pi over b. So in this case, since we're looking at the graph, we could figure out the period, and then we have to solve for b. So to find the period, we just have to look at the graph. We don't have to use that quite yet.
Is the period 2 pi?
Yes, the period is 2 pi. So it's the distance that it takes to complete one full cycle. So the period is 2 pi. Now from here, our midline tells us that C is equal to 0. A is equal to the amplitude, which is 3. And B is equal to 2 pi divided by the period, which is 2 pi. 2 pi divided by 2 pi is 1. So now we can construct our formula. So we have y equals A, which is 3. Sorry, we have negative sign here. We have negative sign here, so we'll have negative 3 times sine. So the negative comes from here. The 3 is A. Sine of B, which is 1 t. If you just write t, that's fine. Plus C, which is 0. So y equals negative 3 sine of t. Any questions there? Okay, moving on then to graph B down here. Is this sine or cosine, and will it be positive or negative?
Positive cosine.
Positive cosine, good. Any questions on that? Okay. What is my A in my equation? What will my A be?
4.
4, good. And what will my C be?
0.
0, good. And lastly, we have to find out what B is. And B is 2 pi divided by the period. And my period, if we measure from peak to peak here, is what?
2 pi.
2 pi, good. So again, we'll have 2 pi divided by 2 pi, which is equal to 1. I didn't give you very exciting examples, I guess. So when we put all this,
How did you get 4 for the amplitude? Is it just because that's where it starts?
It's not just because it's where it starts, it's the distance from the midline to the maximum. So it happens to be where it starts. But if this midline was moved, this would start at a different value. But it's the distance from the midline to the peak. Okay. So now when we put our equation together, we get y equals the amplitude, which is 4, times cosine of b, which is 1, times t, plus c, which is 0. So this is the final answer. Any questions there? Okay, moving on to C. Am I using, for C, am I going to use sine or cosine, and will it be positive or negative?
Would it be negative sine?
It will be negative, but it won't be sine. Yeah,
Cosine.
it's going to be cosine because we're starting at a minimum. This is the minimum. Okay. What is my midline, or what is my C value?
0.
0. Good. And that's because that's where the midline is. If I did 5 plus minus 5 divided by 2, I get 0. Right. What is my amplitude, which is the distance, or what is my A value, which is the amplitude, which is the distance from the midline to the maximum?
5.
Good. And lastly, we have to determine what B is, which is 2 pi divided by the period, which in this case, if we go from the minimum peak to another minimum peak, what is this distance here?
4.
Good. 2 pi divided by 4, which is pi over 2. Good. So now we have all the pieces to put together our formula. So we have y equals negative a, which is 5, times cosine of pi over 2 times t, plus c, which is 0. And this is the final formula. Any questions? Okay, there's no questions. We will move on. This last graph here, graph D, is it positive or negative cosine or sine?
Positive sine.
Good, it's positive sine. What is my value for C in my formula?
0.
Good. What is my A value?
3.
3. And B is 2 pi divided by the period. And what is my period?
10.
Good. So 2 pi divided by 10 is equal to pi over 5. So we have y equals 3 times sine of pi over 5 times t as the final answer. Any questions?
Why is it 10?
It's
I
10
thought it was
because
supposed to be at the top of the I thought it was supposed to be at the max, like below the max. Or is that just for cosine?
so the period is just the amount of time it takes to complete a whole cycle. So if I start my period by counting here and then go here, that'll give me 10. Or if I started at the peak, which is at 3, and I went all the way to here, and I took the difference from 3 to 13, I'd get 10. So it doesn't matter where you start it as long as you get a complete cycle in.
Oh, okay. All right.
Good question. All right, I have an extra question for you. Some a freebie, I guess. So what, I'm not going to grade this question, but I just want to make sure you understand this. So what would the formula for B look like if the midline was y equals 2? How would I change this formula? Y equals 4 cosine of t would become what?
4 cosine of t plus 2.
Good. 4 y equals 4 cosine of t. And I would do plus 2 because we would just add that midline for the c value. Any questions on that?
Quick question. If you change the midline, wouldn't the amplitude change?
So the amplitude would not change because the amplitude is just the distance from the midline. So in all of these examples, the midline is 0, so it looks like it's just where the max or the minimum are, but it's just that distance. So if I shifted this up 2, this maximum would shift up 2 as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep, good question. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Moving on then to problem 3. Problem 3, the average number of daylight hours, H in Anchorage, Alaska, H that Anchorage, Alaska experiences is a periodic function, H of f of t, where t is equal to 0, corresponds to the month of June. The graph of f of t is given below. And then we have to do a few things. So the first thing I'm going to point out here is the graph at t equals 0. This is the month of June. That'll be helpful a little bit later. Okay, so in part A, we're told to identify the amplitude, midline, and period for the periodic function modeling the average daylight hours in Anchorage. So it's going to be best probably to determine either the period or the midline first. So let's go ahead and start with the midline. Since this one isn't nice and easy like the other examples where it was, the midline was just on 0 and easy to see, we have to go ahead and use our the formula to determine the midline, which is y equals max plus min divided by 2. And here the maximum is 19 and the minimum is 5. So we have 19 plus 5 divided by 2, which is 24 divided by 2, which is 12. So the midline is y equals 12. Okay. So if we have our midline at y equals 12, again, you don't need to draw this graph as long as you have the answers for A, B, and C. I'm just drawing on the graph to help explain. All right, our midline is y equals 12. So now we have to figure out the amplitude, and the amplitude is the distance from the midline to the peak. So what is the distance from 12 to 19?
7.
Good. So amplitude is equal to 7. And then lastly, we have to determine our period. And the period is the time it takes to complete a full cycle. Let me choose this color. So if we start here, and by the time we make it to the next peak, we are here. If we look down at our y values, that's at 12. Our period is 12 months. And the amplitude is in hours. Okay, any question there? Okay, moving on to part B. We have to go ahead and write the formula that models this the daylight hours in Anchorage, Alaska. So first off, am I going to use sine or cosine, and will it be positive or negative?
Positive cosine.
Good, we're going to use positive cosine. And we know that A is equal to 7, B is equal to, don't know. C is equal to 12, and we have that B is equal to 2 pi divided by the period, which is 2 pi divided by 12, which is pi over 6. So our formula is y equals 7 cosine of B, which is pi over 6t, plus C, which is 12. Any questions there? Okay. Part C, what is the average number of daylight hours in the month of November? So if June is here, this would be July, August, September, October, November. So November is the 5th month. So we're going to have y of 5, essentially, equals 2, is equal to, we'll use our formula, 7 cosine of 5 pi over 6 plus 12. Okay, this is where our unit circle comes in handy, just to see if we might end up with a nice number. Cosine of 5 pi over 6 is negative square root of 3 over 2. You could go ahead and look at your unit circle for that information. But this then is equal to 7 times negative square root of 3 over 2 plus 12. This isn't going to be a nice number. It doesn't simplify to a whole number. But you could go ahead and plug this into your calculator, and that's about equal to 5.9378, which is about equal to 6 hours. Any questions there? Okay, moving on. Problem 4, the volume of air in the lungs of a woman at rest at certain times is shown in the following table. Assuming that the maximum volume air in her lungs occurs at time t equals 0, so this is the max, and the minimum volume of air in her lungs occurs at the time t equals 3, it's the minimum. Give the formula of the periodic function v of t, modeling the volume in the woman's lung at any given time. And it has to be of this form that we've been using this whole time. Okay. My question to you is, if we're going to model this, are we going to use cosine or sine?
Sine.
Why do you say sine?
Because it starts at 0.
So the time starts at 0, the input, but remember when t equals 0, we want to know what this value is.
Okay.
And so since that's starting at the maximum, where are we going to start? Or what are we going to use?
Cosine.
Cosine, and it'll be positive cosine. So positive cosine.
Wait, I have a question.
Yep.
So, sorry, there's cars passing.
That's okay.
So if if it was if it started at 0, like if 2.4 was 0, then would it be sine?
It might be if 0 was the midline, but it doesn't make sense for 0 to be the midline, because when you take a deep breath in and let out all that air, then your lungs don't go into negative amount of air in your lungs, right?
Yeah.
But if it started at the midline, then it would be sine.
How would you know if it was the midline?
We would have to find the midline,
Oh, okay.
which we have to do anyway. So next, let's find the A value, which is, remember, the absolute value of the amplitude, which we could find the amplitude by max minus the min divided by 2, which will be 2.4 minus 1.9 divided by 2, which this is equal to 1/4, 1/4. Okay, next we have to find the midline, which is y equals, remember, the max plus the min divided by 2, which is 2.4 plus 1.9 divided by 2. If you plug that in your calculator, you're going to get 2.15. Y equals 2.15. And then we have to figure out what the period is. Can someone tell me what the period is?
6 seconds.
Yes, 6 seconds. Good. Right, the time it takes to get from max back to max. All right, so we have to find B. B is equal to 2 pi over 6, which is equal to pi over 3. So now we could just throw this equation together. So we get V of t is equal to the amplitude, which is 1/4, times cosine of B, which is pi over 3 times t, plus the midline, which is 2.15. And that's the final solution. Any questions there? If there are no questions, you are free to go. I will flip back to page 3 in a minute. Have a good rest of your day. I will see you Friday.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
After problem 3, can you go back to problem 1, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mhm. There you go.